And before we start talking about Dr. Myburgh's presentation, I want to ask her to tell us, do a little plug for the Digital Humanities Lab in the College of Liberal Arts. Tell them what's happening, what are the plans?
Absolutely. So the Africana Digital Humanities Lab is a relatively new initiative. It started or was launched last semester um, with Dr. Rico Chapman, the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and then also working with Deatrice Roberts and a whole host of faculty, also collaborating with our friends at the Margaret Walker Centre, who I can see on this call. So thank you for being here. Um, the lab looks at the intersection of Africana studies, Black studies, and then critical kind of technology studies and emerging technology. And so I'll actually be doing a little bit of an overview of what digital humanities is, and then also what Africana digital humanities looks like for anyone who's not familiar. But we are about to announce some open positions for faculty fellows, graduate fellows, undergraduate fellows. And the home of the lab is the first floor of liberal arts. I think it's room 154. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure that's right. But yeah.
All right. Well, yes, be on the lookout for that. We have lots of opportunities related to AI and digital work on campus. So we'll definitely help you get the word out on that. All right. So I'm going to let Dr. Myburgh take over. She is coming to us from halfway around the world right now. So tell us what you have to share, Doctor.
I am. It is 85 degrees here, not to rub that in anyone's face, but sorry you're all experiencing the cold. Um, So what I want to talk about today is it is sort of about digital humanities, but it's sort of inspired by digital humanities because I want to talk about the role that speculative thinking can play in creating a framework for student creativity. So I want to look at what speculative pedagogy and digital humanities are, and then think about designing an assignment with those approaches in mind and talk a little bit about why that might matter, especially right now, especially with the advent of generative AI and all of that. So, what I'm hoping is that by the end of this, you may walk away with a draft. Perhaps it's not a full assignment, maybe it's just a sort of student activity, or maybe it just gets the wheels turning. So, one of the things I was thinking about when it came to this workshop is why speculative thinking can be such a significant catalyst for students. And I've kind of seen this happen in classrooms, especially in discussion. And so, as I was doing some research into this, I was uncovering scholars who were talking about the ways in which students who have to operate under different forms of constraint can sometimes be very, very impacted by that in terms of the way that they are thinking expansively about ideas and about creativity. And so at HBCUs, for example, our students are working under certain constraints, the resource constraints of the institution, sometimes constraints that they're experiencing in their personal lives. And they're incredibly adaptive and resilient and inventive as a result. But they're not always given the space to imagine expansively outside of those constraints, outside of those limitations. So I want to think about imagination and speculation as a part of agency because it lets students speculate to challenge deficit narratives. They can surface what's missing and they can think about liberatory futures as well. So I want to think about how do we create this environment that can center freedom and critical inquiry and possibility for our students. And I think that's why it kind of matters. Okay. Um, so what is digital humanities? And I see Garrett's on the call, digital humanities manager from the Margaret Walker Center. So you can interrupt me and correct me at any time. But this is how I understand digital humanities, that it's the study and exploration and preservation of human culture using digital tools and methods. But more than that, it's a way of building and sharing and questioning knowledge through digital forms. So that might include visualizing data. It can include annotating sources, um, collaborating publicly and presenting knowledge and information publicly for critique, and really inviting students into research that is multimodal and publicly engaged. So, getting students to produce things that then live out in the real world as a form of knowledge making. So, it is an intersection of technology and the humanities, but it's also a way of thinking about knowledge production. Um, Black digital humanities has emerged as this sort of subfield of the digital humanities and really reminds us that the digital humanities is not something that is neutral. So that work of reimagining knowledge through the digital or through technology isn't neutral. And Africana digital humanities or Black digital humanities is building on Black studies, public history, and a lot of community-based methods. Um, and this really looks at how we construct and reimagine community and make space for voices and perspectives that have been historically excluded from knowledge making or from archives and narratives. So it's an intervention into digital humanities itself. Kim Gallen is a really famous scholar of Black digital humanities. She writes that this field is a site of resistance and liberation, but also a site of joy. And I think that's a really good reminder for us as educators that the work that we're doing with students doesn't always have to be about critique. It can also be about recovering kind of possibility and creativity and dignity in knowledge making. So that's a very, very brief overview. But in terms of what digital humanities means for us today, I'm thinking about it as a strategy for rethinking how meaning is made. So this is not a field that you need to enter into. It's not a series of tools that I'm going to show you. It's just a way of thinking about how we might engage students in forms that are multimodal, assignments that may be public facing or iterative and collaborative, and how these different forms of thinking and making knowledge just make different types of thinking and critique possible. So, one of the other framing things that I'd like to talk about is that in digital humanities and archival studies, we really focus a lot on the ways in which facts get made. So we look at the moment that of fact creation, fact assembly, fact retrieval, and then retrospective significance. And we notice that each of these phases is shaped by human decisions. So the moment that a fact is recorded, for example, it is recorded by someone. And so within that, there are also silences. Silences enter into each of these phases, and how we address that kind of depends on different forms of knowledge making and helping students look at these different phases and notice the gaps and the silences in them makes knowledge feel less fixed. It makes it feel more participatory so that they can kind of engage and see themselves in knowledge building. Some questions that one can bring into like class discussion or assignment framing to start to foreground why speculative thinking can be important are questions related to data literacy. Speculative assignments help students sort of foreground these questions. But I'm going to stop talking for a second and open this up for us to think about this, maybe just have an open discussion for 5 minutes. How do you all understand each of these questions? And that may be coming from your own discipline or just off the top of your head. So feel free to drop in the chat or come off mic. Um, what constitutes a fact? How do you know? What is data? How is it constructive? How do you handle absence or silence in data and information? And what might an absence or gap in data tell you? So, anyone want to respond to absolutely any of those questions? And again, they may be, grounded in your discipline, or this may be just how you kind of organically are responding to these questions.
Well, Brittany, this is Rondi. I am actually, if you can go back to your previous slide, um,
Sure.
and you're talking about the moment of making, I'm just kind of trying to figure out what, and I'm just being very transparent here, what the digital humanities is outside of putting things in a digital space that are humanities. And I'm not trying to stop what you're doing or if you plan to talk about that. I'm trying to see how these pieces come together because I'll be honest, I'm kind of lost right now.
Yeah, that's fine. That's
I'm
fine.
like, okay, I'm like, wait, I thought this was so I don't know. And
Yeah.
as far as, facts and whatnot in my space as a rhetorician, then in the field of media, and then that whole communication discipline, the idea of what is constitutes or is a fact and everything else over the years, these things continue to be transformed and people creating false facts and different things, so many competing narratives. But if you could just kind of, I don't know if I missed it. I've been listening since you started, but this is going a
Yeah.
very different way, and I'm really lost. I'm not trying to be disruptive here. If you plan to get to it, I can just hold on and wait and listen as well.
No, you're fine. I do want to come back to what you just said about the way that in your field in communication and media studies, the idea that a fact, what it is, has been transformed or has shifted, and that idea of like different narratives. That's sort of precisely what these kind of questions might foreground. In terms of digital humanities, I think digital humanities is sort of the intersection of studying, it's of course the humanities in these digital formats, but it's also a way of thinking about how digital tools and modes of kind of producing, not just producing knowledge, but sharing knowledge can foreground particular questions. So, how can particular digital tools allow us to be critical of particular ways that meaning is formed? One of the reasons that I'm looking at ideas of fact is because we look a lot in digital humanities at things like metadata. So when we're doing things where we're looking at archives, for example, we're tagging different aspects of that information. We're constructing different meaning related to assets and related to facts. And so we will dive into this kind of a little bit more. But the reason I didn't want to do a deep dive into digital humanities is because a lot of that can be relatively kind of technical and tool based. And this is more about what does it mean for us kind of pedagogically. So, what are some of the tools that we might be able to take from this idea of speculative thinking? And so that's why we're just starting with a discussion about facts. So we are going to deep dive into that a little bit more. Does that help a little bit for now? So we will talk more about it, but this is just sort of a framing discussion.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
No problem. Yeah. But I think your point about, for your discipline, what constitutes a fact, the fact that that is transformed, is exactly the kind of conversation that one might want to have with a student when we're talking about these things. And I see in the chat here, Craig says facts can be based on perspective. Um, and this again might be quite different depending on which discipline you're coming from, because there's a way in which these questions get students to think about objectivity and subjectivity. I see another chat here. I think we have to be careful because missing data can lead to biased interpretation where people fill in gaps with supposition. Absolutely. So, gaps and absences in the data tell us a lot about power. They tell us a lot about who is responsible for constructing a particular narrative. They tell us a lot about who has been in control of recording particular types of data or metadata and things like that. So this is in a lot of ways about media literacy and data literacy. And those are two things that digital humanities as a field really kind of asks us to look at as well. Our brains fill in gaps to make sense of things. Yeah. So in some ways, gaps in data allow for speculation that could be positive or negative speculation. I'll keep going so that hopefully it makes a bit more sense. Candace, were you going to add in
I
there?
just wanted to say I like the fact that you differentiate between facts and data because data is a specific category of fact that is supposed to be perfectly objective. You are collecting information of a certain kind in a certain way. Um, I don't know about facts if they are quite that objective.
Yeah, yeah. And it's changed too. I think that these definitions of what effect is, like philosophically, have changed for us and have previously been grounded in like a very kind of European academic worldview, and then that has also had to be deconstructed and shifted. So it's a really interesting conversation to have with students as well as just a framing discussion. How do they understand how knowledge is constructed? Um, how does that work for them? So we can come back kind of to speculative pedagogy. That was sort of just a pause there, but speculative pedagogy is something that is really, really central to Black digital humanities because it gets students to ask this question, what if things could be otherwise? So speculation is a form of critical inquiry. So not a form of escape. It lets students think about futures. It lets them reimagine some systems, but in doing so, it wants them to identify what is missing. So when we think about speculative pedagogy, we can think about it as a way to think historically about the future. And so in that way, it's very serious. It gets us to think about how we prepare students to intervene in systems, not just navigate systems. So, speculative thinking in digital humanities refers to the act of thinking about future possibilities. And this can take many different forms, but it's guided by these three questions. What do I imagine the future to look like? What is preventing me from achieving this future in the current world? And what needs to be changed or invented to get past this barrier? And so, in a lot of ways, these are design thinking questions. They're teaching systems thinking, they're teaching agency, and they're teaching critique. And these questions, I hope, can be applied across lots of different disciplines. Um, so, just going to anchor this really quickly in an example before we keep discussing things. Imagine in a history class, you have this traditional prompt, write a paper or a research paper explaining the causes of the Montgomery bus boycott. A speculative prompt might be create a fictional archive of a future protest movement that was inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott. What artifacts from that protest movement survived? What stories were erased? So, both of these assignments require research. Both of these assignments demand synthesis of that research. But one of these is explicitly inviting students to think about erasure and history, but also future and legacy, and also possibility. And so it's just a slightly different framing so that their thinking moves through more of this kind of systems thinking process. So it's sort of about how we're framing this for students. So speculative assignments aren't random acts of creativity or sort of like fantasies without purpose. We want them to be anchored in inquiry and framed in context and really purposeful in what they're opening up for students. And pedagogically, this is about creating some room for creative risk, training students to think about systems and connecting learning to the future, not just the past, really foregrounding what does this mean for the future that you're imagining. In terms of what we're actually assessing as faculty, it's this question of is this concept well developed and coherent? Does the work make meaningful links across these ideas and these contexts? Does the form that the student presents this in support the content that they've created? and are students able to explain their choices? And hopefully, this is all going to start tying together because one of the reasons why I was sort of foregrounding thinking about facts and data um, is that speculative thinking can be something that can counter or be a little bit more resistant to generative AI, or at least enable students to think critically about generative AI. Because what we want to do is get students to interrogate what counts as data. And that is really a digital humanities methodology in a lot of ways. So, what is it that counts as data, and what conclusions have we been drawing from that data and its interpretation? It can ask students to examine the politics of absence in an archive, in data, in information, and also metadata. Hopefully, it gets them to shift from the consumption of information to the authorship. So we talk a lot about, Craig talks a lot about product to process, right? So, no, shifting from product to process. So foregrounding the process and also the limits of algorithmic knowledge. So we know that ChatGPT can produce an adequate essay. We know that it's really good at pattern recognition, but it can't necessarily invent meaningful gaps in an imagined archive that is based on the lived context of our students. It's not going to create with perspective or positionality in the way that they can. And so, this kind of speculative work that we're doing, we're trying to resist automation because we want context and creativity and critical authorship. At the same time, it's about fostering critical data literacy. I would say also critical media literacy, digital literacy. We don't just want students to be able to read a chart or read an essay. We want them to know who made it. What does that thing silence? What alternatives are available? How digital humanities plays into this in a more kind of concrete way is that it's often in the forms that the outcomes of these assignments might take. And so, if you are someone who's really interested in digital humanities, you may be assigning assignments where the outcome is something like a map. Because what it encourages students to do is make visible geographically these different layers of data and information, but also different powers and systems. Or if you're getting them to create an imagined archive, that is going to foreground kind of memory and voice. A timeline might look at rupture or continuity, and a story might look at nonlinear logic. And so these may all take a digital form. So it could be that you're using a tool called StoryMap.js, and I'll put that in the chat here again. I just didn't want to make this a tool-heavy session. But StoryMap.js is a really, really user-friendly open access tool where you can get students to plot geographically a narrative or a story. And so it's a really, really great way to bring in a digital humanities tool to sort of activate the stories that students are able to tell about particular things. So, what we're going to do, and I'm going to provide examples of this so that we're really clear on what it is we're doing before we kind of enter into it, is we're going to look at designing an assignment that asks a student to explore something through a speculative lens and in a digital humanities inspired format. So we're going to think about one assignment. It could be one activity, it could be one concept, it could be something you already teach. And how could you reframe it in a way that is speculative? So asking that question, what if? What is erased? What's missing? And you can think about also what might it mean to ask a student to present the outcome in a way that is digital or multimodal. Is it a digital blog? Is it a map? Is it a graphic of a timeline? Is it a photo essay? So what are the ways in which these visual components, these multimodal components, might support the kind of knowledge that they're producing? So I'll give us some examples first so that we can kind of sit with that for a second. So an example could be ask students to curate an archive of a community movement or future that was never allowed to exist, right? So invent this archive that never existed. They could create a few imagined artifacts like text, image, sound clips. They could add made up metadata. So, who created these artifacts? Title, creator, date, origin. They could write a short statement explaining the purpose of this archive, what values shaped the archive, what's missing from the archive. And so they're producing this sort of future historical artifact, and at the same time, they're becoming critical of the way in which it was produced. Um, and so this is looking at things like how does archive shape memory? How does metadata reflect power? How do students tell stories through silence and through form as well? There are lots of different ways that we could think about that. So, for example, have students create a story of what happens the day that the internet collapses. Map a cooperative economy after capitalism if they're in business. If your students are looking at mathematics, what is a timeline of erased or forgotten ways of measuring the world? We could have a map of Jackson State University transformed by climate change in the year 2050. We could have an archive of banned or abandoned technologies. And so all of these things are about critically thinking about what does the future look like for students in a way that is creative and speculative. So what I think we can do, and we can do it together collectively here, is that we can think about taking 5 minutes to sketch out your own idea. And we can talk through this on the call and in the chat as we're having questions. But you could think about something like what course or topic could you look at where students might design a speculative something? Is it a map? Is it a blog? It could be an essay, it could be a short story, it could be something really standard. What would they explore within this? From which perspective? And what is it that you're hoping through this speculative inquiry that they are uncovering or imagining in some way? And so we can talk through those ideas out loud as well. And at this point, I'll pause and just make sure that we're all on the same page still.
I can hear the wheels turning in people's heads. Like, what would I do? How would I do this? It makes me think about an activity that I do in my early American literature course. One thing I have them do is they go to a digital humanities archive, actually, and I think it's the Library of Congress, and it has all of these has an archive of letters from people in the um, 17th, late 16th, early 17th century back home to wherever they came from in Europe, about what they are experiencing as immigrants and kind of what that looks like for them. And I would love to take that. And after they've read that and we've done our analysis and discussed it, have them then create a contemporary archive based on what's happening here in the US, um, with immigration, and what would those letters or emails or texts look like from now. I mean, I could definitely see that as a way to get them to think more critically about um, both the archive process itself, but also what are the things that people value enough to tell people back home about their experiences? What are the things that people who are immigrating to a new place consider worthy of note?
Yeah, I think that's an amazing example. And one of the things that came to mind as you were talking is it's a reflection of the contemporary time. could be even interesting to push it further, just as maybe it's not an assignment, but just a discussion. What does a future look like where, and this is where you kind of push it to the next level, is like, what does it look like where immigration, it no longer exists? Like, the world has open borders. And so it's about really getting them to shift a mindset. And it's hard to imagine that. But it's kind of in that activity that they can start to surface some things. Well, how would we even get there? What would that even look like? How would that even work? Is that a good idea? And so it's really about pushing that really kind of dynamic future thinking for them. But I think that's an amazing example.
Yeah, no, that's great. That is helpful because I definitely am in the um I don't know if I would like stuck in the factual world and in the speculative, like pushing it to something like you said, a world without borders. What would that look like? Um, it wouldn't have occurred to me. So yeah,
Yeah.
I need this class.
Yeah, Dr. Williams.
Well, this is interesting, and it has me really like Dr. Pizetta said. She can hear the wheels going. It's probably mine, but I was thinking about something that, and I guess I'm thinking more literally about silence and data, the data not being there, in terms of there were times in the past where traditions were passed down orally but not written, and I was just kind of thinking that what about a moment in history where you're going to reconstruct or speculatively reconstruct something that it exists, but it's not a fact or data or written down, where you choose a moment that was spoken and or maybe performed or just a ritual kind of thing, and it survived through oral speaking, but it's not, or in memory, but it's not actually written. And in an English class, having students kind of think about, is there any tradition in your family or that you've heard of or whatever, and that you can identify how to finish the story or make it to the point where someone else can come and the data is actually there. I know that's all out there, but I'm just kind of working with that in my mind once I'm listening to
Yeah.
what's being said. Um,
Yeah.
but it might be enslaved people and conversations that they may have had after emancipation, or in the how they were trying to avoid being caught, and it's probably some conversations there that they had, or even just women and teachings that come from their moms and things like that, that I would like to believe that in a small way it kind of, that's my thinking of a prototype for this moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful example because it really speaks to that idea of like what is absent from the archive. Like what is how do we deal with that then? How do we deal with that in a way that can be generative and kind of recuperative for students too? So I think that's a fantastic example. And I think it also really makes me think about like there's a whole genre of speculative fiction, right? And this idea that people are going back and sort of looking at, based on what is available and the contemporary moment, how do we kind of re-envision and recuperate these historic spaces that were silenced? And it's tricky because, so for example, when I was doing my dissertation, if I had sort of thought about speculative fiction as something that was generative or academic, that would have been like squashed, right? Because that's not how history works. That's not factual. That's not objective. And so I think it's really interesting for us to think, though, within a classroom space. I still think that that has so much pedagogical value to encourage students to think about things in a particular way. I don't know if anyone else, because it makes me also think about critiques about like, okay, like revisionist history, if we're doing this speculative work in the past extending into the future. So I wonder, like, does anyone want to push back on these kinds of things as well? Like, does that make anyone else think about objectivity, subjectivity in their discipline?
So Brittany, my mind is trying to think through what this means for communication and the different courses that I taught, that I teach, that I've created. And I can tell you one of my challenges right now is actually the fact that I've learned that in my teaching career, I have to also teach and support my students being creative. And a part of this that I keep thinking through, and maybe too much, is actually context. And they have to have context around how to create these kind of things to be speculative. But at the same time, the context for so many different people, for different people, it was salient in what is useful and important, and what exists is so varying. So what I'm thinking, um, I'm thinking this will have to actually involve, and I literally I have something, but I have nothing because my mind is actually causing me to be speculative in my own pedagogical development right now. And so I would have to think through the process of teaching them through various contexts for different groups and people, specifically around um, if it's a course on intercultural communication or persuasion. And then I'll also have to give them some concepts around these things, and then give them some narratives to build off of, because they literally get stumped in their own heads around trusting their creative process.
Yeah, I think that that is such an important point, and that is probably the bit that I sort of sped through at the beginning about this, the like, why does this matter? Um, and when I was thinking about this workshop, I was thinking a lot about, it takes a lot to get speculative thinking out of students. It takes a lot of discussion. It takes, like you said, a lot of context building. Um, One of the games that I play with them is a game called Crazy Eights, and they hate it. But it's really, really good. So, what you do for Crazy Eights, and I don't know if this is going to be useful for anyone else in their classroom, but you take a piece of paper, a blank piece of paper, fold it into 8 pieces, and you set a timer for 8 minutes. And you pose a question like, how do we solve, I don't know, this is a bad example, Dr. Gaines, but how do we solve intercultural communication? In the future, how is intercultural communication solved? Everyone understands everyone and we all get along. It's a terrible example, but you set a timer for 8 minutes and they have to answer that question, a speculative based question. They have to come up with 8 different solutions or possible answers to that question in 8 minutes. And so on each square, they're writing down a different answer, or they can draw a picture. But what it's doing is it's forcing them to put out different responses as quickly as possible and break down that stopgap, that voice in your brain that says that's a bad idea. And so the idea is getting a quantity of responses first, and then going back and looking at all of the responses and saying, okay, which of these is best? So it's sort of creativity under constraints. Um, and the idea is that there are no bad ideas at that moment, at that point, and that they can then go back and evaluate those ideas. That's one thing that I've done, but a lot of it is through discussion. So I don't know if that sort of helps with anything, but that's one way to break through. But I completely agree with you that that it is difficult to encourage this kind of thinking. But I think that's why it's so important to just do it every now and again as an activity. Did anyone else have an example that they were thinking about or wanted to share? Okay. Well, that's great. If you do drop it in the chat, that actually leads nicely into the next bit, which is students are going to need help with this. So that was exactly what I was going to talk about next. Um, and so this is part of the learning, right? So a big, big difference for them is to show them an example, even a brief one. When I work with students on this, a lot of the time we're thinking through what would their own Black digital humanities research project look like? And so some of the speculative thinking they do, especially in art history, is around what would a monument in the future to like Black history or life or Black futures look like? And so thinking through examples with them, discussing examples with them of what is out there already, what exists in the present, but then also examples of what are some of the barriers that they may encounter to realizing their possible future. So examples are really good. You can have templates that they could remix. You could definitely break things into stages. So stage one might just be a proposal where they hand in a massive brainstorm, or you do a big brainstorm with them in class, encouraging them to think about prototypes as part of digital humanities is also another big thing. So encouraging them to explore and hand in drafts and get used to a kind of iterative process. So if they're creating a photo essay or a map or a timeline, they're going to create a draft and then it's a prototype. They're going to come back to it. Reflection on their process is another good one as well. And using rubrics can also really, really help students sort of see where you're going and what you're thinking about. Um, so I guess my questions for you are, um, where would this fit in your course? Is this something you would do as a framing discussion? Is it something you would do an assignment? Could it replace an existing task? And what might grading this look like? Um, so what this could actually look like in practice is maybe it's a 1 week module in an existing unit, maybe it's a midterm alternative. Or a lot of the time, it's just a discussion warm-up question to get them thinking about a particular topic. Um, so I definitely think we want to invite student authorship and teach towards futures, not just outcomes. And just in terms of the exit reflection, I was thinking maybe we could talk about what assignment do you all already teach that you might think about opening up? What are you interested in trying this semester? And what kind of support would you need to realize this? Are you looking at exploring different kinds of outcomes for assignments like maps or timelines? We can also support within the Africana Digital Humanities Lab. So we'll be opening up some trainings, some recordings of tools. So if you are someone who's interested in tools, and I dropped that one in the chat there, but we can do demos, we can help out with that. Um, so yeah, I was just curious about, does anyone have an existing assignment that they would think about sort of repositioning in a particular way or reframing as speculative? Or any other thoughts or questions, we can just open it up. I can also go back to talking about digital humanities more specifically if people have additional questions about that too.
So, Brittany, I have an assignment in my intercultural communication class where the students are to find 10 different cultural artifacts from their cultural group and then another cultural group and apply the different concepts pertaining to intercultural communication. Now that we're doing this with you, I actually could have had them do that with their own cultural group across 1 to 3 generations. The same
Yeah,
assignment, but understand what it looks like, what culture looks like in different generations.
Absolutely, absolutely, and connecting it across and a future generation, right? Imagining maybe they have to sketch or create a collage of what does an artifact look like in future from their culture. And so they would have to think about the way that their culture was adapting. They would have to think about what does that future world look like that has produced this cultural artifact for my culture. And then they could kind of reflect on that. Um, and that would be really interesting in terms of what it would let you assess as well, um, which is do they understand the way that society and culture impacts the artifacts that are produced? Do they understand the way that it impacts how they're used, how they're valued? And then what does that look like in the future? So you can really analyze their ability to sort of critique those aspects of the artifacts and what they communicate about culture. So I think that would be really interesting.
Dr. Myburgh, this is Laura Miller.
Hello.
I'd like your thoughts and maybe your feedback or suggestions. I'm thinking about one of our newer courses, Language and Social Justice, and we look at bias, but I'm thinking about an assignment where I'm having students imagine a world in which there is no language bias or linguistic bias. What does that look like? Um, So if you have thoughts or ideas on that, because I think that might be a way to kind of introduce them to this new model.
Yeah, there are a lot of different directions I think that could take. And that could even just be at first kind of a classroom discussion, because what you might find is they're really uneasy with imagining that world and what that looks like. And so you may need to kind of talk
Yes.
that
Yes.
through with them a lot.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, and then it could be something like it could be imagining a world, for example, where everyone, well, there are a couple of different ways you could do it. One of the things that I think has been really interesting that's been sort of called out about AI is the way that it standardizes language in a way that is, very, it makes this very obviously formal academic English kind of this like norm that it is generating. And so, is there a way that like language is being standardized?
Hmm.
Um, and that obviously carries its own decisions and its own biases. Something that could be interesting, maybe that would anchor them a little bit more, is to ask them, like, imagine a future where um, everyone everyone speaks exactly the same. So there's no
Oh, okay.
linguistic bias because everything's flattened.
Yeah. And it
And
would be interesting perhaps to note that even if that becomes the standard or the norm, in what other ways will then people choose to categorize, classify, maybe that's a good point. I'm thinking through it now. So I appreciate that.
yeah, yeah, because maybe then also it's like I'm thinking about, I don't know why this made me think of this, but I was thinking about sort of 1984 and the way that in that future world, Big Brother is controlling
Hmm.
language, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so it's also interesting for them to think about, well, what would that mean in terms of expression? So and then that could be a scaffold. So they imagine that world and the pros and cons, and they see the bias in that world. And then maybe they then imagine another world where everyone is still able to express themselves however they want, but
Hmm.
they're not received with, that level of bias or prejudice based on how they talk. So one where it's sort of the anti, like it's flattened, and then another world where it's different. And so that can also be a way to do it, is to find what's the jumping off point that might be easier for them. I don't know
Hmm.
why it's easier to imagine dystopias than it is utopias.
Yes.
So that can often be a starting point, is to first say, all right, let's think about this negative dystopian world. And that might prompt them to think, well, what does that look like in the reverse? But I think that would be a really amazing assignment.
Thank you.
And I wanted to say too on that, if you think about the ethical limits that we place on imagining others' voices.
Mm.
Ethically, we just kind of naturally do that sometimes. So that's another perspective of what ethical limits do we place on imagining others' voices or languages.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. That's an excellent point.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's an amazing assignment. And again, I mean, even if these aren't full scale assignments, even if they're just sort of touch points with students in the classroom, it can really be a way to get them to engage. But I think also, especially with Black digital humanities, like these are things where we are asking students to think about what liberation in the future looks like, and how do they get there, and then hopefully how can they be a part of that as well? And so it's been really interesting for me to sit with and think about all of these things, as someone who is a historian, because we're so grounded in the past, and I think understanding the past is so important, and accurately telling, narratives and information, and looking at the past. But it's also recognizing that speculation has happened, in the writing and recording of history, and that there's power and freedom in asking students to think about that future in a way that's creative as well. Um, so I think that that can be really, really generative. And I think that even if those are, the other thing is a classroom debate. So getting students to debate, what the positives and negatives of a particular world that they've imagined are. That's another really good way to get them involved. Um, yeah, but I think that's a great example. And I'll put up here, this was sort of the list of um, ideas, and you'll see here that these outcomes, in the sense that they are digital outcomes, might be more aligned with the kinds of outcomes that we see happen within Black digital humanities as a field. So it's pushing, speculative inquiry into these outcomes that are also creative because they visualize dynamics in a certain way. So I thought, a story map tracing a vaccine that was never developed could be really interesting as well. And so um, I do think when you're thinking about this, think about how to push it even further in terms of the speculative aspect, because that's when you're going to get some really, really interesting outcomes. And it's about encouraging students to think, all the way out there. And then we can be the guides that kind of bring them back through our frameworks into sort of thinking critically then about the present moment as well. And so I think that can be really helpful in the classroom, and hopefully it can make them more engaged as well. Um, and that's all I had for today, but I'm absolutely here to answer any questions, and definitely will be available through the Africana Digital Humanities Lab to think more about tools, and if anyone's curious about the subject, we'll be there and we can offer more workshops and things like that too.
Thank you, Brittany. Would you drop your email in the chat?
Yeah.
Oops. I am sure that people will start thinking about what they want to do, and they may want to reach out to you. Um, and just as a reminder to everyone, this is recorded. We'll have the slides up. If you are like me, you have about 50 ideas floating around, and you're going to want to come back and review this and think through it again. But I think it's just wonderful to embrace the idea of encouraging our students um, to create in ways that only they can. They bring their own experiences, their own worldview into it, and like Brittany said, be the guide for them to help them think critically about it. But yeah, this was a wonderful session. Thank you so much, Dr. Myburgh, and thank you all for participating, for sharing your ideas and your questions. I think it makes it a much richer experience for all of us. So thank you for joining. Are there any last questions for Dr. Myburgh before we
Oh,
leave?
Yes, I have a question. Dr. Myburgh, is there anything that you can recommend to read further about speculative pedagogy, speculative thinking? I'm intrigued by that idea of using speculation as a pedagogical approach.
Yeah, I will share a list of the sources that I've been looking at and that I use to sort of prepare some of this. So I'll share that with Dr. Pazetta, and maybe it could be included as well in the session. We can circulate that
Okay.
because there's some really good reading, and there are scholars who look at it specifically within the context of like HBCUs as well.
Hmm.
And also another thing I should mention is that a lot of it also comes out of Afrofuturism. And so I will add in some sources that look at Afrofuturism in the classroom. How does that enable kind of this future speculative thinking as well? So I'll bring all of that together.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all, and I hope that we will see you again very soon. Next Wednesday, we have an AI workshop about creating AI integrated slash resistance assignments that engage AI in a way that you can help students be more critical about it. And then next Friday, Dr. Anwar Ahmad will talk about turning your research that you've done alone or with students into grant proposals to expand that research. So we have great things coming up. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.